So, very happy to have you all here today. We're delighted to introduce Anacláudia Rossbach, who's joining us today, the Executive Director of UN Habitat. Anaclàudia is an economist with a vast experience in working on housing, and I think she's going to give you a bit of an insight into her career trajectory and how she got to where she is today in her talk. We're especially happy that Anaclàudia is here to talk about the global housing crisis, and that under her leadership, UN Habitat has identified housing rights as a central issue in their new strategic plan. Housing is the foundation of how we all, as humans, engage with the world and act as a baseline from which we're able to flourish and to participate in our societies. But despite this, housing is an increasing parameter of urban inequality across most of the world. A concern with housing justice has been a core preoccupation for the DPU since we were set up more than 70 years ago, from Otto Königsberger's work on tropical housing through John Turner's advocacy on community-led housing models and his idea of housing as a verb. A continuing focus on housing is central to a lot of the work that we do at the DPU today and throughout the history. And actually we have a lot of colleagues here today that I can see who are working on housing in different ways. So a focus on housing inequality has been a core preoccupation with the DPU, with colleagues like Karen Levy, who's here, and Caroline Moser, looking at gender inequality as a parameter of housing inequality. Other colleagues today looking at things like migration and citizenship status in the context of the refugee crisis. People like Giovanna Astolfo and Camilla Buono have been working on that. We also have many colleagues, and I won't name them all, working in different ways on housing displacement and evictions, and looking at the ways that, for example, developmentalist infrastructure logics end up being used as justifications to displace people, or, for example, environmental and political agendas, which, while positive, are being used to different ends. Another very strong focus of the DPU in relation to housing has and continues to be how civil society mobilizes around housing claims and housing advocacy, and our work with organizations like the Asian Coalition for Housing Rights or the Habitat International Coalition, to which recently DPU's Adriana Allen was the president of, all looking at different ways in how civil society can mobilize around housing claims and housing rights, and also critically the question of how those claims can be scaled up to the city scale. Housing justice is also something that we've actively collaborated with UN Habitat on for many years. When I was first working at the DPU in 2003, under the leadership of Patrick Wakely, we worked with UN Habitat to produce the the World Cities Report on the challenge of slums, which was an emblematic World Cities Report looking particularly at the crisis of housing, which we're revisiting today. And also today, DPU's Paroj Banerjee is working with UN Habitat to produce a chapter for their new upcoming World Cities Report on the last history of the last 40, 50 years of housing. So we're very happy to see this continued collaboration going on, and we're very excited to hear today what Anaclàudia has to say about the global housing crisis. We're going to start by showing you a film that Anna was involved in, and then I'll hand over to her. So thank you very much. So, Anna, can I hand over to you?
Yeah, of course. So we do have a couple of slides. Yeah, so good evening to all of you. Thank you for coming here today. I hope I'll have energy after a full day of mission here in London, but I always, when I'm together with students, with young people, and in these academic environments, I get the energy. I don't know from where. Is there a, how can I pass the slide?
So do you want me to do it for you?
No, I can say there
too.
So
if you just use
okay.
the down.
Okay, this one?
Yeah.
Okay, so there was the first thing about my professional journey, but I don't know if you're interested in that. So usually, sometimes when I go talk to students, people ask me to tell how I landed here and everything, but just briefly, I studied economics back in Brazil. I'm from São Paulo, Brazil, and at that point in time, my idea was to contribute with my country because the country was a young democracy. One of the big issues was inflation, and I saw how inflation was affecting the lives of the people, of the poor people. And I wanted to help and fix that, right? But later on, I realized that economics is a very interesting entry point to deal with the social, political dilemmas of the society. And this program that I mentioned on the video, Minha Casa Minha Vida, was part actually of economic or counter-cyclical program of the government of Brazil to face the 2008 financial crisis that was pretty much generated by the mortgage crisis, by the housing issue in the US. So I ended up working on this program, designing the part of the financial part of the program, the subsidies and incentives, the combination of incentives of this program, and how this program lines up with the cities, with the local level, the social movement and communities part of the program. And there I think I actually found my purpose that I actually expected to have when I attended university. So I worked for the city of São Paulo, I worked for the government of Brazil, I worked for the World Bank, for other UN organizations, and international think tanks all around housing. Basically my whole second professional life, 30 years, I started about 30 years ago or something like that. I have a first life working for the private sector, but I will not enter into details. But my point here is that housing is fascinating. And now that we are living this global housing crisis, and I am in this position as executive director of UN Habitat, I'm faced with both the challenge of working with member states, working with partners, with you, with cities in dealing with the global housing crisis, but also with the fascinating journey of being able to co-create actually the solutions, and this is actually the direction that we are giving to UN Habitat. So the crisis, I think you saw the video, I don't have to enter much into that, but these are the numbers we work with, around 3 billion people that live in inadequate housing. The informal settlements is 1 billion plus, but we still think that this number is underestimated. The difficulties that the Census Bureau have, the difficulties that governments have in collecting this information are very clear. During the pandemic, most probably we experienced an increase of this number. There are many issues that affect this collection of information. There is the logistical issue, even safety and security. There's the issue, the political issue in many cases, and also one important aspect, you will probably be impressed by that, we don't have a global definition of informal settlements. As I mentioned in my slide, we don't have a definition for homelessness, a global definition for homelessness, but we also don't have a global definition. So definitions that countries work are different, so it's very difficult to understand how they are evolving. And they are part of SDG 11. We are custodians of SDG 11, specifically SDG 11.1. And then the number of homelessness and so on. And we are talking about a global crisis because now structural issues that mostly affected countries of the global south, as I said before, limited markets, limited fiscal capacity from the governments to support social housing, limited purchase capacity from people to buy houses or rent houses, created this major gap that people filled in through informal settlements, that people filled in through the social production of the houses, right? But now this is also affecting globally most of the countries. In most of the countries, probably know, that by yourselves or people close to you, people don't have money to buy a house, to rent a house, young people, elderly people, or they cannot afford to stay in a house. because of the life cycles and the conditions and so on, right? And then we also had, after the pandemic, inflation that affected the housing prices a lot. And as I said in the video, land has been a critical bottleneck. It's the most expensive input for housing, and scarcity of affordable land is there. So talking about informal settlements, so many people ask me, why do we have informal settlements? And there's the whole debate about, is that right or wrong, is this legal or illegal, etc., right? My point of view is that informal settlements, they are there. They have been a modus for the many people, many households to find their places in the cities. If we look at Latin America, for example, during the years where Latin America urbanized, the gateway to the cities were the informal settlements, good or bad. These were the option or the ways and the means people had to access education, to access health, to access economic opportunities, to find jobs. It might have generated situations where one might look and say, okay, these cities were not planned to receive those, and now we have issues with transportation, with mobility, and so on. But they generated the opportunities for people in many parts of the world. And this is happening now in Africa. Africa and Southeast Asia are the areas that are mostly urbanizing in a very accelerated manner. So we are going to have, in the next couple of decades, about 2 billion people coming to cities globally. So in 2050, the idea is that our numbers show that we are going to have about 70% of the population living in cities, and 90%, the majority of these people are coming to cities in Africa and Southeast Asia. And as I said in the video, in Africa, in average, 50% of the urban population already live in slums, meaning that if we don't reorient how the cities are planned, if the housing policies are not there, if the incentives, the subsidies, right, for people to access adequate housing are not there, we are going to experience a growth of informal settlements and a growth on the peri-urban areas of the cities that, on the other hand, affect also the environment, the natural resources that we have to our cities, water, that affects even food security, right? For us at UN Habitat, transforming informal settlements is at the core of our current priorities, and it's a reality that we just have to accept. It is there, and we have to work with member states and work with cities and work with communities to equip them, offer the mechanisms to deal with that properly through policies and so on. We also mentioned the displacement, and you mentioned you have a body of research and work around displacement. At the same time that we need houses because people cannot afford, because the supply is not meeting demand, because we haven't built in many places, because of the limitations that I mentioned before, we are losing houses. So we estimate that we have 120 million people affected by forced displacement, by climate change, by climate events, or by conflicts. So this is exacerbating the housing crisis that we have. But when we talk about adequate housing, what is it that we talk about, right? We talk about houses that have good conditions of habitability. We talk about the security of tenure. You spoke about evictions, right? So nobody wants to live in a place where you are in the imminence or the threat of eviction. Accessibility, because we need, to get to places and to get to the house. The availability of services, the location is critical, and this is something that we haven't managed to get all over the world. Cultural adequacy, affordability, and sustainability, which wouldn't be part of the definition, but it's coming now more and more to the picture as we experience this climate change. And but then housing, I mean, I can do 1,000 lectures on housing, and here people can have many debates. There will always be different angles for us to understand the complexity of housing. But the point of housing, and what I said in the video, is really we need to respect and understand the different contexts and the variety that we have all over the world, right? And through our work, really orient. So we have this type of houses. And I think this type of houses is very interesting to look at that, because when we talk about housing, it's not only the need of housing, it's how housing is shaping our cities, how housing is shaping our planet. And if we look at the city expansion, for example, urban expansion, what is generating the fact that we are growing much more in territory than in population? It's housing. So if you drive around Africa, if you drive around Latin America, if you drive around Asia, here, what you see how cities are growing is through housing. So you have gated communities, you have condominiums, you have informal settlements that I mentioned as well, right? We have public houses. But the government, because the government doesn't have money to build houses that are well located, because land is too expensive. And we don't have the right instruments to control and regulate the cost and the price of the land. So dealing with housing means also dealing with the ways cities are growing, and we are expanding our footprint, and how it's affecting the environment, how it's affecting the rural areas and the communities and so on. And then, of course, the situation of slums, they are different also. We cannot have one formula to deal with slums all over the world. Some slums, most of them, of course, are located in areas, many of them that are risk-prone, etc., because this is where people end up living. And some of them we can upgrade, some of them we cannot upgrade, right? But the point here is to really understand the different situations and what kind of measures we can take. Informally or formally, occupied buildings, but overcrowded and dense, and different types of slums. So how did we get there? So why are we at this point? So if we look back at the different policies and trajectory that we had in terms of housing, if we look at the 70s, then we see that housing was treated as social infrastructure, that we had many countries working with state-led provision of housing and so on and so forth. So there was this vision there. Although we know that in many cases this provision was not reaching out to everybody, right? Like Brazil, the country I come from, again, state-led provision that really didn't achieve to everybody. Then we have, between the 80s and the 90s, we have the idea of the market-led housing systems. So we moved from the welfare to the market leading and being the solution for dealing with the housing needs. And ownership has been always a very strong pillar from the policies all over the world. And then, of course, and towards 2008, and then after 2008, the crisis, the financial crisis, right, that generated pretty much by housing becoming a financial asset more than anything else. So clearly, the very sophisticated housing finance system that has been established in the United States and elsewhere didn't work and collapsed at this crisis in 2008. And then housing, the concept of housing as an investment, the housing as an asset, and so on, has expanded. And we started to see, more people excluded from the housing markets, even in the places where the purchase power was higher or inequality was lower. And then for many reasons, of course, housing became a preferred asset. No speculation, of course, it's a stable asset, it's a stable investment, right? And then it goes along with all the process of concentrating wealth globally. So what are the implications of that? The implications of that is that we have a mismatch between the financial flows and how cities are planned and how we use land, how we address the housing needs. So from one end, we have investments, financial investments that lend anywhere where the regulations allow, so not necessarily where we think this investment will generate a public good or will help us, or cities, or the land to fulfill its social function or its ecological function. And on the other hand, you have the scarcity of the financial resources, the public investment, the public subsidies to attend the needs of housing. So we have a market that is more and more far away from the people and lending in ways that are not sustainable, ecologically sustainable, urban sustainable, and socially sustainable. And the scarce money that is available, people saving, and the fiscal capacities and so on being more and more marginalized and excluded from the mainstreams of the cities. So then, what is it that we can do, right? Because at the end of the day, housing is a right. So housing became more and more an asset. Governments, were not capable to address the magnitude of the housing needs through policies. The market was not able to reach to the whole of the households, and at the same time, it's a right. And how can we, make sure that we keep that way? So as I said, UN Habitat is the custodian of SDG 11. So, and especially SDG 11.1 is receiving a lot of attention from my end, because the SDG 11.1 talks about housing. And SDG 11.1 talks about informal settlements. And we are living a global housing crisis. But we also agree that if we don't achieve SDG 11, that talks about cities and communities and housing and informal settlements, we won't be able to achieve the whole set of SDGs. Because how can we increase access to education, or to health, or to job opportunities, or to tackle informal employment if people don't have a roof over their heads? So the SDG 11 is critical. We will not be able. These pictures that you saw, people living in informal settlements with precarious access to water, sanitation, basic service, energy. How can we achieve the SDGs with 1 billion plus? It's impossible. So our approach towards the SDG 11 is that it is actually a critical condition to achieve the 2030 agenda. We also follow the new urban agenda. I don't know if you know what's the new urban agenda. Everybody knows. Everybody knows about the climate agenda, but we also have our agenda. It's the urban agenda, the new urban agenda. The new urban agenda was approved by member states, endorsed by member states, exactly 10 years ago in Quito, Ecuador, during the Habitat 3 conference. And this year, we are celebrating 10 years. So this year is very important for UN Habitat. In July in New York, we're going to go to the General Assembly. The Secretary General of the United Nations needs to report to the General Assembly what happened in the last 10 years. And we have to go there and tell member states how we are organized and what we think is possible to be done in the next 10 years of the new urban agenda, because the new urban agenda goes until 2036, right? And what we are going to see, and this is happening in July in New York, back to back with the review of SDG 11. So this year, we are reviewing SDG 11 and we are reviewing the new urban agenda. And I will go to New York. And I will go to New York in July and I will say, look, we are far behind the SDG 11. Far, far behind the SDG 11. We only have 5 years. And the new urban agenda gave us principles to deal with the SDG 11. That's critical for all for other SDGs. The new urban agenda recognizes the social and ecological function of the land, meaning the land has to work as a public good for the overall of the society. The land needs to respect the environment and the nature. We should plan cities for people. We should plan cities for the nature. The new urban agenda says that we need to recognize informality and the informal settlements, and we need to embed them in urban planning, in national urban policies. The new urban agenda tells us that we need participation in dealing with urban policies, and we need multi-level governance. The local action is critical because the solution is at the local level with the communities, with the local governments, with the local authorities. But we need the national governments to set up the laws, the regulations, the frameworks, the policies, and to invest and to bring actually the urban agenda at the center of development in their policies. So one of the mechanisms that we are working with is an open-ended working group on housing. So what's an open-ended working group? Member states come together and we support member states in terms of setting norms, setting definitions, and find ways to deal with the global housing crisis. So right now, we have about 50 member states that are engaged in the process of the Intergovernmental Working Group because they are worried about the housing crisis. So we are supporting them in norm setting, in define, okay, so how we are going to support and how we are going to address the global housing crisis. So last year in Nairobi, where I'm based, we had the UN Habitat Assembly, which is a mirror of the General Assembly. It's an universal assembly that supports the governance of UN Habitat. And there, 105 member states agreed that UN Habitat should focus on access to housing, access to land, access to basic services, and work on informal settlements as a critical priority. They said that because it became clear that, as I mentioned before, housing is a key driver for urbanization. And if we don't tackle housing, we will not achieve our ultimate mandate, which is sustainable urbanization. And understanding that if we work with housing, we'll help and we will be able to work with the UN family in tackling 3 critical areas of impact. One is climate change, as I mentioned. So right now we are pressuring actually the land and the natural resources. We have the infrastructure that needs to be built, the generation of emissions, the materials, and so on. And we have the informal settlements suffering from the climate events because they are the ones on the front line. Then, of course, poverty and inequality. How can we overcome the challenges of poverty and inequality if people don't have access to housing? And the third one is the prevention and recovery and reconstruction. With the magnitude, with the dynamic of the disasters and climate events that we are facing, we need to build not only houses, but resilient houses. Adequate and resilient houses. So we understand that working through housing, we can have this impact in these 3 major areas, but we cannot build anywhere. We learned that as well. So we have to plan where we build, because housing needs to be well located. So urban planning is critical. Land policies is critical. We need the finance, as I said, because the finance needs to meet the location. At the end of the day, we build houses somewhere on some ground. Cities that are better planned, they are more prone to attract finance, investments, private, public, domestic, international, and better equipped to generate revenues, starting with property taxes. So planning and finance is critical. The other mean of implementation, new urban agenda, participatory multi-level governance, connecting the SDGs. Then we need data, we need information. As I mentioned, it's difficult to assess what's going on with SDG 11. We just had a meeting. The urban sector is pretty much under-researched. We need to have more information. Thank you for all the work that you are doing in anticipation, because we need to have more research. We need to understand more what's going on in the urban sector. And we cannot do that by ourselves. That's why I'm here. We need to work in partnerships. We need to work in coalition to increase the body of research. We need to communicate. We need, to establish as much as possible partnerships and coalitions, and we need more resources. We need to mobilize the resources that we have, bringing cities, bringing housing at the center, bringing informal settlements at the center, but we also need more money. We need more money domestically. We need more money from the international financial architecture. So what is it that this working group is doing, right? So this working group has started to meet in December 24. And so one of the things is definitions. We need to agree on definitions. So we are using this group to look at the definitions that we mentioned. This working group is restating that housing is a human right. This working group recognizes that it's important that when addressing housing, we look at context and we recognize that the solutions will be different in different places. This working group is looking at the point that we really need to look at security of tenure, but this is a progressive work. We have to look at the adequate financial tools, and we need to bring housing at the center. So we have to raise the profile, the political profile of housing. So, as I mentioned before, recognition of the social and ecological function of the land. Finance needs to also serve a purpose, right? Not finance for finance itself, but feel a purpose in the society and helping us to deal with all that. The markets are there. We need the markets, but we need these regulations, to make sure that the market will grow in the direction that we want it to grow to attend the housing needs. And we need social protection. So. These are some pictures of different, types of houses, and we have to accept this is probably what's possible to be done in the case of a resettlement of a camp. But then, what's the next agenda? How can we work with these communities to make these places more livable? Right? I come from Brazil. It's easier for me to talk about Brazil. Brazil in the constitution recognizes the social function of the land. Brazil has a very progressive legal framework called the city statute, and a whole institutional arrangement to support the production of housing that is connected to the cities, right? Recognizing the social function, recognizing densities, which is one area that we have to work, and recognizing how we can actually capture the value that's generated by densities. So part of the solution, in my mind, and I believe the work of the working group is going towards this direction, is make sure that we understand the dimensions of this housing crisis, and we understand that we have to develop solutions that are feasible in the short term. And we cannot expect to build sophisticated arrangements to deal with the housing crisis. Meaning that to deal with the housing crisis in Africa, we have to find the African model. To deal with the housing crisis in Asia, we have to find the Asian model. To deal with the housing crisis in Latin America, we have to find the Latin American model. The issues that you are facing in the UK are other issues, the issues that Europe is facing and North America is facing. Thank you. So what I can realize from the work of the working group and from my missions and interactions is housing is gaining centrality. So governments are understanding how housing is important. And as you can see in the political debates all over, right, the cost of living has become a central aspect and the cost of housing has been a central political aspect. We have the African Union, for example, last year, actually in 24, we had for the first time, we had one African Union forum dedicated to urban issue, the first African urban forum, a recognition from the African Union that urbanization, dealing with housing, informal settlements is critical. In the EU, European Union, for the first time, there is a commissioner dedicated to housing, there is a housing plan for the EU. You see the local and regional governments mobilized in the EU and elsewhere looking at housing. So it's gaining track and it's gaining attention. We are recognizing the different models that are there, but also understanding that there is a role that the markets will play and the markets need to play. I believe, as I said in the video, that we do have the tools there, the technical solutions out there, but we still need to find ways in making this knowledge, this expertise, and transfer horizontally this knowledge and this expertise, make it available. We still need a cultural and mindset shift. People still expect to live in single-family homes, while I don't think this is sustainable. And we have to look at densities, we have to look at how we are maximizing the built environments in our cities, we have to look at the vacant spaces, the underutilized spaces that we have in our cities. If we don't do that, then it will become very expensive, not only for the nature, but expensive for the people and for the government and for all the stakeholders. So one of the platforms that we have at UN Habitat to promote this horizontal exchange is the World Urban Forum. So the World Urban Forum, I don't know if you heard about the World Urban Forum or attended the World Urban Forum. It's a very interesting thing. And I would like to talk a little bit about the World Urban Forum, because the World Urban Forum, it's a UN conference, but it's different than any other UN conference. It's the second largest conference within the UN after the climate, after the COP. In Cairo, we had about 25,000 people participating. And it was approved by the General Assembly to be the stakeholder engagement mechanism for UN Habitat. What was the thinking 20 years ago? The thinking was, when UN Habitat was upgraded up to the program that we are today, the thinking was, the world is urbanizing, we need to have an entity or a strong program within the UN to deal with that, but right now we don't have. We have a limited amount of resources, human resources, professionals, etc. So we need to have an urban forum, a platform, where UN Habitat can complement its expertise. So it was designed to be the place where the organized civil society, grassroots, groups of women, persons with disability, elderly, the academia, the private sector, professionals would come together and advise UN Habitat. Advise UN Habitat on the work of UN Habitat, advise the governance of UN Habitat. It became, in the last 20 years, a very large urban conference, and this year in Baku, we hope to connect these two dots. Keep it as a large conference. We expect to have thousands of people going there, sharing their practices, sharing their ideas, reflecting, but we also expect that as a result of the World Urban Forum, we have a call to action from Baku, oriented to member states that will support the implementation of our mandate. A call to action that I can take and bring to New York when we are reviewing the new urban agenda and say, okay, listen, this is what the civil society is doing, is saying. This is what local governments are saying. This is how we can work together in a coalition to deal with the next 10 years of the new urban agenda. So I hope that this World Urban Forum will be a place where we can also, these and the next ones, promote this horizontal share of knowledge, practices, and build the critical mass that we need, and the partnerships and the coalitions that we need to deal with this housing crisis. So our strategic plan goes until 29, as I said. I don't know if we're going to be able to solve the housing crisis until 29. For sure, you have that alone, not. But I hope that we can, during this time, build the right partnerships and the right coalitions to make sure that the know-how that we have, is spread, to make sure that we bring political attention to housing and we find collective ways to assist countries and cities and organizations to deal with the housing crisis.
Well, thank you very much to Anaclàudia for leaving us feeling inspired at the end of a talk about a crisis, which is a nice way to finish the end of that. I'd like to hand over now quickly to Professor Barbara Lipietz, who's going to do a response, and then we'll have some space for questions.
Thank you very much for this really inspiring talk and for the possibility of giving a very quick response. It's a bit of a daunting task after this, but I will be very short because I can see in the audience lots of colleagues who have a lot of things to say about the topic, and also a lot of students here who will want to be asking and probing Anaclàudia on what she has just said. So first of all, I just wanted to reiterate how inspiring this talk was. I think in such a short period of time, you've not only given us a really sharp analysis of the scale and the depth of the housing crisis and its global ramification. I think it's a very important point that you've made around the localization of these issues and how they manifest in very different ways. But you've also given us some inspiring pathways, right, to address this, to get out of the crisis, and also these pathways embedded in a very strong reaffirmation of strong normative ideas, such as housing as a human right, and also the fact that a lot of the realization of this approach to housing is based on the recognition of diverse and people-centered approaches for realizing these rights. And I think what's been very interesting for me also is that without mincing your words and with an attentiveness to the longue durée, you've really showed the persistence of the housing question and the crisis of the housing question, and you've helped to highlight both enduring processes at play, but also some of the new ones, including many of the processes connected to the neoliberal term, the financialization and commodification of housing, but also the way in which the climate emergency is moving and shaping some of these processes and, in fact, accentuating the crisis. So you really help to create a sense of the polycrisis in which housing is a center. But again, I think each time what you've done is to bring the other side of the coin and to alert us to the ways in which these trends are being challenged and how there is a political movement to recenter housing as a political question, not least, and with the sort of the reemergence of nation states taking housing seriously, not least through your coordination and your advocacy around this, but alongside many others. And I think you've sort of highlighted the renewed appetite for collective solutions which are built on the energies and know-how of urban dwellers, and those also through collectives and through partnerships able to build on these experiences, and to reclaim in a way the role of the state, the redistributive role of the state in the process, and ways of taming the private sector as an ally. So thank you for this. Thank you. I think thank you for me as a teacher. I want to say a big thank you because I think our students hear us say these things, but it makes a big difference, I think, to have somebody in your position with your institutional weight and the kinds of connections that you have to say things that are going in a similar direction. I think it really creates a sense of a collective endeavor that we're all engaged with to try and address this manifold crisis. So what I want to do, and I think this is particularly important, in a moment when the violence pertaining to housing and beyond is so pervasive, and when the language and the rationale for rights is actually being challenged in ways that were not necessarily conceived a few years ago, with growing impunity. And it's important that we have moments like that where we are reminded of this shared goal that we have and the possibilities of action in allyship. And so in this last few minutes that I have before I pass on to colleagues here in the audience, I want to focus a little bit on this notion of allyship. And I'm aware that you've targeted this talk at an academic audience, so calling on us to participate in this collective movement, right, to address the housing crisis. So I want to reassure you that we've heard and we are here and we are ready to engage, indeed very much that we are active allies in the process. So allies, I will say very briefly, because a lot of the frames that you're using around this notion of housing as a right, or the frames that consider the lived experiences and the practices of informal dwellers not as something to be erased, but actually something to be built upon and to learn from and to try and enable and grow, are very much things that are central to the DPU and have been for many decades. So of course we had John Turner and Otto Koenigsberger were very important colleagues of ours, and I think we all live in that legacy. And I'm going to, I don't think I should, I mean, I don't feel quite well placed to, to talk to many of the colleagues that I see here who talk about this notion of of housing as a verb, housing as urbanism, housing in habitation processes. I'm going to let my colleagues come in and sort of express the ways in which they are engaging and helping to rethink housing and ways of addressing the crisis. And I think also very important processes is not just framings of housing, but also the development or the co-development or the supporting of instruments around finance, around planning, around land that many of us have been working at the DPU. An important point here that I'd like to make is that this knowledge production, which you're calling us to support, UN Habitat, is something, I think we need to be clear that we're not talking about just any kind of knowledge production. And I think, again, a very rich legacy of the DPU has been the ways in which this knowledge has built on alliances and long-term alliances across many different regions. And without these kinds of alliances, I think the kind of theory building that we've developed at the DPU would not be what it is and would certainly not be fit for purpose. And here I want to reiterate the kinds of engagement that we've had over the years with the Asian Coalition for Housing Rights, Shack Dwellers International, some of the, I don't want to pronounce it badly in Portuguese, but the social movements in Brazil, who have also been so important in framing some of our reflections, and others also in the European context. Alongside also, of course, progressive professionals and progressive local authorities. So I think this kind of knowledge production is really the one that we want to push forward and that we've developed in the DPU, a kind of knowledge production that recognizes multiplicities of knowledge, that also conceives of knowledge production as a way of liberating ourselves, emancipating ourselves from the kinds of knowledges that have led us into a wall or that are perpetuating certain status quo, and a kind of knowledge production that is actually a political act. And some of our colleagues in Europe recently were reminding us, when we were co-writing a manifesto for affordable and democratic housing in Europe in the context of the new first ever, I would say, affordable, actually it's not I would say, the new first ever affordable housing plan for Europe. They were reminding us that precisely this housing reflection and this co-production of knowledge and solution is a democratic act. And if we don't do this, if we don't engage in this, we are really risking to entrench and deepen the democratic deficit, which is another big crisis within which we live. So I just wanted to basically pin down the kinds of collaboration that university can be engaged in. And maybe before I pass on to my colleagues, a reiteration of the fact that addressing the housing crisis has to be a collective act, has to be an act of allyship, because the forces of financialization, of commodification of housing and urban life generally are there, and they're not wanting to release power easily or on their own, and so there very much needs to be a collective endeavor in doing so, and especially because housing is a multi-actor, multi-scalar process. We really need to think about ways in which we can leverage our different kinds of power, a different capacity to not only convince, but also show alternatives across a whole variety of groups. So I'm going to stop here for now, because the more I look at the audience and the more I'm seeing faces of people who have a lot to say about this. But I wanted to thank you so much for coming today here, and very much look forward to many other such endeavors. It's a really important moment for us to have you here. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much to Barbara. So we now have around half an hour for questions and answers. Barbara said she was looking forward to hearing from her colleagues, but I think she means all of you by that, and not just DPU colleagues. So we'd encourage questions from anyone. Can I ask you, because I'm sure a lot of people have questions, to keep your questions brief and make sure that they're actually questions. And perhaps we can take them in groups so Anaclàudia can digest a bit. So maybe if we take the first 3 or 4 questions. So I've got one here, and one here.
Here back, then I can see people's face. Thank you.
So would you like to start?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much. I have many questions. I'm going to keep it to one single one. So as UN Habitat, obviously you work with member states. That is a different governance level than cities, or even more local solutions than that. And these actors are often, if not always, at odds with each other politically. How do you work with that tension? How do you circumvent it? And can you maybe give examples of how you as UN Habitat work around that?
Okay, so that's the first one. Then I think we had one here.
Anaclàudia, thank you for your presentation. My question for you, I imagine you've been all around the world and seen many different models of urbanization. Can you tell me what's your favorite city, or
This is very tricky. I cannot answer this one.
And one here.
So, just on the point you made about kind of shifting the view of housing from assets to like a human right, how does the UN and how can like the kind of university organizations and research engage with the financial sector to encourage private investment into affordable housing? And how would that work with sort of wider infrastructure in regards to energy and water to make these homes affordable to run?
Okay. So would you like to start with those, and then we'll get another batch?
Yeah. I think, the UN works with member states, but UN Habitat has a special place because naturally we work with cities and local authorities, local governments, because of the nature of our mandate. We work around urban planning, we work around housing. They are grounded somewhere, as I said. So we have developed all over, our existence a direct relation with many local and regional governments, with associations of local and regional governments at the regional level, at the country level, at the global level. And recently, we supported the Secretary General. He prepared a report to the General Assembly just last year on how to strengthen the role of local and regional governments within the UN system. And we actually supported the Secretary General in doing this report. And very interesting fact, we consulted UN organizations, and our finding was that many UN organizations are working with local and regional governments and with cities because they realize that if they don't work with these actors, they will not be able to implement their mandate. So it's an increasing, actually, recognition of the importance of local governments, of the importance of cities by the overall UN family. And it is true, the open-ended working group is member states, the intergovernmental processes, our governance is member states, but we do have the World Urban Forum, which is a great mechanism where we interact directly with local and regional governments at various levels. It's also a way to break tensions and to bring people together. And then at country level, of course, we have to, our bosses are the national governments, are the member states, but we have been perceived as also an honest broker and a convener between local and regional governments, between, civil society organizations. So at this point in time, one example is in preparation for Habitat 3, the member states established the Habitat committees. And these Habitat committees were like participatory consultative spaces. Some of them remained until today. Some of them became institutionalized. But I think, since then, UN Habitat has gained this space, this territory to kind of convene and etc. Sometimes there are tensions, but then you have to work on the context. So in relation of the favorite city, I don't think I can answer that, but I love cities. I mean, cities are just amazing. Being in a city and explore the different parts of cities. I grew up in a big city. I think cities are, the source of, everything that we need today in terms of, to evolve as human beings. It's in the city, coming together here in this place, thinking and creating and innovating and transforming the world we are. So, I think I love all cities. And then assets and human rights. I think this is a challenge. And this requires a lot of collective engagements. We have been working, I can give a concrete example. We have been working in Africa with the African Union for Housing Finance, with the banks, the private banks, but also the private developers, so that we can see, and help them to identify and connect with governments, connect with the public policy, and see what kind of regulations, what kind of incentives, what kind of mechanisms can be leveraged by the public policy, by the cities, through city plans, through zoning, through land policies, by the national governments, through investments, through financial regulations, to expand, the markets, and also making them see. And I think they already realize that the potential market expansion, considering that in this continent, specifically in Africa, we're going to have 600 to 800 million coming to cities in the next couple of decades. So this is what I saw in Brazil, for example, when I was working on this large-scale housing program. The market was very limited, and the market expanded also through medium-sized cities, other geographical locations. The point is, if you find an equilibrium, if you find the right incentives, if you have the combination of the local action, the urban plan, and the policy, you can create a situation, enabling environments for the market to grow and to grow and attend the demand that's closer to the needs that we have.
Thank you. So another round. There was one waiting there, and then two here, one there. Okay, so let's go for four. So
my question is very straightforward. So do you think that social housing is financially viable option under like an increasingly financialized world? Do you have any like cases where social housing investment was realized?
What do you call social housing?
Affordable, decent. I don't have a definition.
You can choose that out and answer that.
Because I come from Cairo, Egypt, and we constantly see that the government is like public agencies consistently being turned into like development corporations so that they're able to tap into the financial markets. So at the end of the day, right, they just want to make a profit. So for example, we have a case of the Informal Settlement Development Fund. It was transformed into a development corporation, urban development fund. So the social housing mandate or like urban renewal mandate was sidelined. So do you have any cases where this kind of social housing investment has been realized?
Should we take a couple more?
Yeah.
Yep. So.
Hi, I would just think your presentation is so nice. I really appreciate it for that. And I just do that, like you mentioned your previous experience before, and I check it in LinkedIn. Sorry. And I find like you have 9 months like working in China with the government too, and you mentioned the Asian, the Real Eastern many times. So I'd like to ask like your thought on China's fast urbanization and the recently financial challenge faced by the developer.
Thank you. Hi, Anaclàudia. I have a question regarding, you mentioned well-located housing. And what I've been reading also recently is that there is also an issue of mismatch. So there is a lot of maybe housing being built also in Africa, but it's not built where it's supposed to or where it's needed to be built. Taking it also from a regional perspective, we also see that a lot of people, apart from natural population growth, there's a lot of people moving from certain areas, and you have abandoned settlements, abandoned housing. There's a lot of countries like Italy, for example, they're selling houses with €1. Shouldn't we look at this from this general perspective of maybe economic job market, because people move to areas for university, for job market, and so on. So is there an angle to approach it in this so that we have a better match, maybe? And second, there is also in the EU Affordable Housing Plan, there is a mention of financialization of housing, of this real estate assets, but I feel there's also a speculation of land, so it goes, and you did mention that land prices, it goes a bit broader than just the real estate, but also land that should be taken under account, and I don't see it being addressed in many countries, so maybe it's just my perception.
And one more, and then we'll, yes.
Thank you. I always have the sensation that we are kind of trying to administrate the crisis. But it's interesting to me to...
Can you speak up a bit?
Yes. For me, it's maybe interesting to think more than trying to administrate the density in a way of dispersion of territorial spaces. In that thinking, in UN Habitat, do you have any hints or ideas of how to maybe de-urbanize or decentralize the development?
Okay, so social housing. Well, I think there's a simple fact that the price of the houses are here and the income of the people are here. And there's a gap. That's the simple fact. This is everywhere. And this gap is becoming more like a common denominator all over the world. The gap is there, right? So how can we cover this gap? So land is, in the average, responsible for, let's say, if you look at the social housing, affordable housing, not so well located, let's say so, at least 50% of the cost of the house, at least, is land. It could be 300% if it's well located, right? It's one of the most expensive, generally, with some exceptions, I would say it's most expensive input for the housing. So we have the materials, inflation, and all of that, right? So the challenge is to close this gap. How can we close this gap? We can make housing cheaper. One way of making housing cheaper is making land cheaper. How can we make land cheaper? We can use, for example, public assets, public land for housing. If the government takes public land and says, okay, this is for low-income housing, then we don't have to pay for land. This is happening in Kenya, for example. Kenya is giving public land for housing. So the end product is much cheaper if a developer would go and buy a land. I believe the mayor of Paris here on the corner did that as well. She allocated public assets, buildings, and so on to social housing. Can it be polemic? Yes, because you're deploying public assets to a certain part of the population. But this is one way. Which are the other ways? You have inclusionary zoning models in North America, here in Europe. I believe here in the UK you have inclusionary zoning as well. I'm not quite sure. Yes. In Latin America, in Bogota, you have inclusionary zoning. In Brazil, you have the social interest zoning. So what is that? You can, or in Kenya, you have the special planning area. So you can take a piece of land and say, look, this is where I'm going to build houses. Or you can talk to a developer and say, if you want to build 100 houses, you have to build at least 10 houses or 17 houses or 20 houses or 30 houses. This is what the Germans are doing in some cities, 30%, 40%, and so on. You have to build a percentage. And then you save the price of land because the developer will come, buy this big part of land, and then allocate 10% or 70% or 30% for low-income housing. So there are some land policies, there are some planning mechanisms, or the deployment of public assets that can reduce the price of land. If we can do that, then we can reduce the cost of the housing. If we cannot, nevertheless, however, there's always a gap. So how to cover this gap? Somebody needs to put money in. And this money is called subsidies. You can have tax incentives, fine, but at the end of the day, somebody has to pay, and it is the taxpayer. Can be subsidies, can be whatever, public investment, can be incentives, you name, but it's the taxpayer because the person cannot increase its income unless we change the patterns and we reduce income inequality, right? So no. Housing is not affordable, and yes, there are mechanisms, but we need land, we need political will to make land available for housing. Sorry, I forgot to mention densities, because densities is also a way to decrease the price of the land, right? So if we have urban regulations that allow densities, we can also work on reducing the final price of the house. So if there is political will, political acceptance by the society that, okay, it's fine to go higher. Okay, it's fine to build there. It's okay, it's fine to build in the public building with the view to the Eiffel Tower. Then it's fine. Then we can have acceptance, to reduce the prices. But you need to have the fiscal capacities, and you need to have the mechanisms. The program in Brazil that I mentioned, I think it was able to do that. It has several issues with location, has several issues with design and so on and so forth, but was able to bridge this gap and generate 7 million houses at the end of the day. China. So I think what happens with housing, and I was talking on Saturday. I was giving a lecture to students of economics, and was more oriented towards economics. And what I put on the table is, look, housing is critical for the GDPs. So many countries use housing to boost their GDPs, right? Massive production of housing, China being one of those. But the US did that too. Europe did that too. Post-war, we had massive housing production. This boosted the GDP in all these countries. Brazil did that post-2008 crisis. The whole program was designed to actually counterbalance the financial crisis that was facing. But in some points, we achieved a limit where, it became, we overstretched the capacities or the financial limits or the economic limits of that. And this happened in 2008 in the US, and this is what we can observe now also in China. But on the other hand, I have been talking a lot about China recently because I think we have to acknowledge the amazing urban transformation of the cities in China. And China moved from massive producing housing to also identify ways to connect those through public spaces, through mobility, through urban planning, to also working more, investing more in urban regeneration. I think the transformation of cities like Beijing, for example, within a range of 15 years is just fantastic. So you go now there's clean air, there is public spaces, you don't listen anything, everything is electrical, there is transportation. So the technologies of, for example, sponge cities that have been transferred to other cities in the world, even we, UN Habitat, are working in transferring this technology to other places like Kenya and Brazil and so on. So I think we have to recognize the role, and how cities have been transformed, and to be more human-centric and more, let's say, nature-oriented. Then the question on, your question was on the well-located the mismatch, and then the financialization, yeah. So on the mismatch, I do agree with you. In certain parts we have mismatch, but if we look at Africa, Southeast Asia again, where we still have the urbanization process going on, we need houses actually. We need to build houses. There's no other way around. But I do believe that in other places you have the built environment that's not being utilized. So I know that some cities and some countries are working towards developing mechanisms of, for example, looking at taxation to maximize the use of vacant, underutilized spaces in cities. Progressive property taxes, for example, or taxation for second houses. So these are these types of policies that are being developed. Of course, the regulation that many cities are implementing towards short-term rentals, the so-called Airbnbs and so on, because this is also taking the supply out of the market and it's affecting the affordability in some cities, in some places. So, yeah, I agree there is a mismatch, and I agree that we need to find ways. Perhaps taxation is one, but again, the land policies and the plan is another one. And in terms of the financialization, yeah, we have to deal that with as a society, and look at that big picture and see, because the point is the financial regulations, they go there, and then we plan cities here. And if we don't align those, they will overwhelm cities and they will overwhelm the citizens. So I think there are talks about regulation, of the financial the financial, of the real estate sector and so on. Perhaps not as much as we expected, and not as robust as we would need to really work that. But I do believe that we can control a lot if we look at the land.
And the final question on decentralization?
Oh, decentralization. What was the question again? The urbanization, yeah. No, see, well, so what we have been working as UN Habitat in the past years is focus on this, what we call, the medium-sized, secondary, intermediary cities. I mean, because they are receiving, the important flow of this migration. So it's important to invest in them right now to avoid, to mitigate the negative impacts in the future. We work a lot around rural-urban linkages to make sure that what's happening in the rural areas, is channeled, economic production through the cities as gateways to promote development, also in rural areas, but also to access the opportunities of education, of the services and everything. So this is the frame of work of UN Habitat. There are some examples of cities that have actually within their borders, that they have expanded their kind of rural areas within their borders. I think São Paulo, where I come from, is one example. In 2014, when the master plan was designed, the city agreed to expand the rural area within the city boundaries to increase, or to leverage, let's say so, the food production within the boundaries of the cities.
Thanks very much. I can see there are lots more questions. However, with the temperature in this room, I think if we go on much longer, it's going to become a health and safety issue. And I think Anaclàudia is probably fairly exhausted and has quite a heavy program. So I'd just like to say again, thank you so much to Anaclàudia for a really inspiring and interesting session.